Well, I can't remember who started the conversation, but I was hanging out with Greg and Janet 3 or 4 years ago, and we talked about having a signature model, which today is what we call the Golden Clipper, and here it is. And I had a lot of input in terms of design and the look of it and that sort of thing. I wanted the 2 extra frets. I wanted to have this inlay pattern, not specifically this inlay pattern, but an Art Nouveau inlay pattern, and Greg was working on that, and I didn't even realize it at the time, but he said, well, you know, the Saratoga Star has an inlay pattern that is basically Art Nouveau, which Greg had designed already. So I was already playing that kind of an inlay pattern, because again, my background is Czech, and I wanted to have an inlay pattern by this artist, Alphonse Mucha, who was a Czechoslovakian artist, Art Nouveau artist. And so anyway, that, and I wanted the resonator to be made out of quilted maple, and they obliged me with that. What they added, which I had not asked for, but the beautiful power shell along the neck and along the resonator here, and also this stretcher band here, as I like to call it, has this hand-carved, it's black chrome, hand-carved, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So it's even fancier than what I'd imagined. And of course it has the gold plating, but the main thing is the sound, of course. It just sounds wonderful, and the neck is just a dream to play. It's a little wider than, say, a master tone kind of a neck, and not as thick as some other ones, not as wide, I should say, as some other ones, or thick. So for my hands, it's just the perfect thing. And again, this has been 3 or 4 years and trying different things, trying different inlay patterns, and in fact, when we first did this, when the Deering folks made this neck the first time, it didn't have any of this acrylic outline on it. It was just the amazing dichrolam, which I'm not sure how much you can see out there in TV land, but this really spectacular material here, which is taking the place of a regular shell sort of material. And originally it was just that with no outline, but I was finding it a little hard to see. It kind of disappeared when you look down the neck, so we decided we should put this acrylic around it, and Greg made the design, and it works perfectly now on every level. I can see perfectly well, and it still has that depth that you get with the dichrolam and the acrylic going around it. When the Dearings and I were first talking about making this banjo, and right after it was just about finished, we decided we better call it something. And Janet said, well, what do you want to call it? Let me think about it. And a month or 2 passed by, and I was busy and thinking about other things, and then Janet calls up and said, okay, have you thought of a name yet? We're going to press tomorrow with the catalog, and can you come up, what have you come up with? I've been thinking the entire time. No, I just kind of let it drop, but then I better get this together. And so I started thinking about clipper ships that were fast, and they existed back in the mid-1800s. And so I like the name Clipper, and it's gold-plated, so I figured let's call this the Golden Clipper. And it works out kind of nicely because the intermediate-priced banjo is going to be called the Silver Clipper. So it was a sleek, beautiful ship, and it seemed like this is a kind of a sleek, because it has such a fast neck, and it's beautiful, in my opinion, so that's where the name came from. So, some years ago I saw Noam Pikelny's Master Tone, and he had 2 extra frets on the neck, kind of as an overhang, and I just decided that I would like to have that, you know, it'd be nice to have those 2 extra frets so you could get the high G, basically. And I never thought to have the neck just start here with the rim and go a little bit farther back that way. I like the look of the overhang. In fact, I have a Fairbanks Cole banjo from the 1883, I think it is, which also has an overhang. So it was like really nice to have this kind of echo that. And plus, when you see these banjos that have the 2 extra frets, there's usually just a straight cut across the bottom, and the fine design folks at Deering put this little curve in it, which just a little touch, but it's a really nice little touch. And it allows you to go, play Sally Gooden way up the neck. Or a little bit of ground speed, Earl Scruggs' ground speed all the way up there. And it's just, once in a while, you just want to keep going, and rather than ending up like, you get actual sound. So there you go. If I had to pick a favorite musician, I honestly couldn't do that. You got the Beatles, and in terms of, it was folks from back in the 60s. Bob Dylan has been hugely big for me. And Van Dyke Parks, who's not that well known, but worked with Brian Wilson on his long-delayed Smile album, wrote almost all the lyrics except for Good Vibrations, and Van Dyke has an album called Song Cycle, which I think is one of the most visionary and amazing albums ever made. That came out in '67, I want to say. And I just actually last week recorded an arrangement that he did for me for this Civil War album I'm working on. So Van Dyke Parks is way up there in my firmament of musicians, but Frank Zappa, Aaron Copland is my favorite classical composer by far, and maybe my favorite musician of all. If I had to pick one to go to a desert island and have nothing to listen to for the rest of my life except one musician, it would probably be Aaron Copland. I've been teaching since 1970, and I did a lot of one-on-ones. I still do a lot of workshops and banjo camps and that sort of thing, but I also have a School of Banjo, the Tony Trischka School of Banjo through ArtistWorks, which is an online school that is nice because folks in out-of-the-way places that don't have access to a banjo teacher can learn also. And I don't know if there's one piece of advice I would give, but one thing I would say is listen a lot. Listen to a lot of music, a lot of banjo music. If that's what you're trying to play, which it is, as a banjo player, I would say listen, because then you know what you're going for. You know the kind of tone you want to hear, you know the notes you want to hear. And I would definitely recommend starting, if you want to play bluegrass, start with Foggy Mountain Banjo, which you can probably find in a cloud somewhere. And then once you're playing, I'd say the most important thing to think about is timing. Timing is everything. I did a beginning banjo book years ago for Alfred Publishing, and I'd written the whole thing, and then I figured rather than just have this all from my point of view, I should ask other people, other players, what they would recommend for a beginner. Earl Scruggs said, play with as many different people as you can. Even as a beginner, you don't have to wait. Jamming is such an important part of the whole equation. So all my best friends, not all, but almost all my best friends are banjo players somehow. You meet just such wonderful people through music. And by jamming with people, you'll learn about timing and backup and playing in different keys that you wouldn't otherwise expect to, and you make solid friendships that will last a lifetime. And one of the most important things is, I asked John Hartford what he would say to a beginner, and he said, timing. Timing is everything, and I agree with him. That would be the one thing to concentrate. Tone is important, ideas of course, but timing. If you have really good timing, the world will be the path to your banjo door. It's wonderful being a Deering artist because there's so much support from the Deering Company, and Greg and Janet in particular, and hopefully it's a symbiotic relationship on some level. But the folks here, the folks that work here, I haven't spent that much time getting to know them, but I really think it's a great crew here, and they'll just try to get things exactly the way you want it. Setting this banjo up, it took a while to kind of get the head tension and get any buzzes that might be in this new neck that we just put on here. We spent at least an hour, if not longer, trying to get it exactly the way I wanted it. And there was no, God, are you done with these requests yet? No, it's nothing like that. Total patience and getting it right. And I know they do that for everybody. And having my own signature model here it's absolutely wonderful because it's what I wanted. Rather than just having an off-the-wall model, which I've had previously, which is wonderful to get a really nice banjo, but to have one that's made to my specs So it's not like, yeah, this is really nice, but I wish I had this aspect or this kind of inlay pattern or whatever, or those 2 extra frets. It's exactly what I'm looking for. So that's the advantage of having a model of my own. I'm really happy. The question is there a holy grail banjo that has meant a lot to me to be able to play? I can't say that there's one, but besides my Deering, which I love, but in terms of like one of historical significance, just out here right now in May of 2016 here at the Deering factory, Greg Deering actually has the banjo that Dave Guard played on the very first, I think, 2 Kingston Trio albums, the one called Kingston Trio and then Live at the Hungry Eye. And it's just this amazingly beautiful inlaid banjo that he had here at the factory, and I got to pick it up, and he had the cover of the first album, this red-covered Kingston Trio album, and there's Dave Guard playing this banjo, and I'm holding that same banjo. And I'm such a giant Kingston Trio fan that, wow, that's that, I'm holding that same banjo right now. And I played a little bit on it, so that was one. And then I was out in Missouri at an Earl Scruggs show, and I was backstage hanging out, and Earl's road manager said, would you like to play the banjo? And this was the banjo that Earl was playing that night, which he'd played on Foggy Mountain Banjo and all these recordings in the 50s and into the 60s. And I went, yeah, I think I would like to play that banjo. So I went backstage, and Earl's got the banjo in his hands, and he hands it to me, and I started playing Ground Speed. Which was such an important song for me, and Foggy Mountain Banjo, the album that appeared on, was such an important album for me and for all bluegrass banjo players, because it's beyond a doubt the greatest bluegrass banjo album ever made, and I don't think you'll find anyone to disagree with me on that. And here I'm playing that banjo. So I'd say those 2 were probably, I've played a couple of other pretty iconic banjos, but those would be the ones that stand out in my mind. I've been playing the banjo at this point, this is 2016, for about 52 or 53 years. I started in 1963, and I started with bluegrass, and I fell in love with Earl Scruggs' sound. And in a lot of ways, that's still at the heart of what I do. But at some point, after playing for 5 or 6 years, I decided I wanted to kind of get off into other territory. And I was listening to a lot of jazz, and I grew up listening to show tunes that my parents would play around the house and classical music. So I was hearing other sounds. In fact, I did this banjo contest at the very first Bluegrass Festival in 1965 in Fincastle, Virginia. And Bill Monroe was there, and the Stanley Brothers, and all sorts of wonderful folks, Jimmy Martin. And Ralph Stanley was one of the judges for the banjo contest. And I don't remember what exactly the notes I played, but it was something like this. I decided, oh, I'll play 9-Pound Hammer, which is a kind of a traditional tune. And I did something like that, and I can only imagine the expression on Ralph Stanley's face as he was hearing this. What? So as early as 1965, after I'd been playing for a couple of years, I was getting twisted out a little bit, musically speaking. And so I just wanted to hear other things in my playing, and I started writing tunes of my own in the later 60s. And then when I did my first album in 1973, I was playing with some folks in New York City, and we were all kind of into stretching boundaries a little bit and coming out of bluegrass, but wanting to hear some different sounds. And our mandolin player, Andy Statman, played saxophone, so I wrote some tunes that had some saxophone on it, and another tune had bass clarinet and drums. So I was just trying to kind of reflect what I was listening to. And thanks to the Beatles and Van Dyke Parks and Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds and Smile and Zappa and just all these sounds I was hearing in the later 60s, yeah, you can do stuff that hadn't been done before. You can try stretching the boundaries, why not? And so I was kind of coming out of that mindset and trying to do that, sometimes writing tunes with more complicated chords. Nothing wrong with G, C, D either at all, but just I was kind of hearing some other things. So I started putting that in there. And continue to try hearing different sounds. I'm working on a new album where I've got a string quartet on one thing, and I've got a march that I wrote, and I've got an 8-piece brass band on there. So it's just, there are really no rules as far as I'm concerned. You can play anything on this instrument. It's a musical instrument. It's not a bluegrass instrument. You can play anything on it. And there are a bunch of us that have been trying to do those things over the years. Noah Pikelny and Bela Fleck and Jens Kruger and on and on and on. So anyway, that's how I look at it. Let's see, my fondest memory is a banjo player. I guess there are a number of them, but let's say two in particular. I was inspired to play the banjo by a guy named Dave Guard, who was the original banjo player in the Kingston Trio. And when I was very young, I heard a song called MTA, which is Charlie and the MTA, big Kingston Trio hit. And there was a banjo solo on it, which went like this. And when I heard these 16 notes, those are the 16 notes that made me play the banjo in that solo. I heard that and was just like, I gotta do this. And I was already playing folk guitar. I started with flute, piano, folk guitar, and then I heard this and I was just gone. And I'm still gone to this day. But it was played by a guy named Dave Guard. And somewhere in the 80s, I was playing with this group called Skyline, and we were playing in New Hampshire, and our guitar player said, "You'll never guess who's here tonight." And I went, I don't know who. It turned out to be Dave Guard from the original Kingston Trio, who was living in New Hampshire and came down to see the show. And he introduced our second set, and I got to hang out with him at the end of the night. So here's this big hero, this guy that made me play the banjo, and I was getting to hang out with him. So that was one. And then the other was, I recorded an album called Double Banjo Bluegrass Spectacular for Rounder Records, and I got a whole bunch of different people to play the second banjo part on each tune. And one of them was Earl Scruggs. I spoke to Earl and his wife Louise, and they agreed that he would do this. And so we played a tune called Farewell Blues. We decided on that tune, and I still have vivid memories of recording this in Bela Fleck's basement. He has a studio down there, and we were practicing it, and Earl and I are knee to knee playing this close, and it was like, if I could have thought when I was 14 years old, someday you're going to be knee to knee with Earl Scruggs playing on a song for your album. And so, and even though with Earl, it's like, he was just a really laid back guy and friendly, and hey, it's Earl, but it's Earl Scruggs. I wouldn't exist without Earl Scruggs. So the idea that we were actually doing this, I was kind of flipping back and forth. It's, it was very casual and seemed normal and relaxed, and yet this is Earl Scruggs. So that was another one of my major banjo moments.